So I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Jacob Ari Lebanz. I direct the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies here at Youngstown State University. I am with Chaya Kessler, who runs the Jewish Studies program at Kent State University, and she'll be speaking with you in a moment. Today is the first of 3 lectures in our new Emerging Scholars lecture series. It's a co-partnership between the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies at Youngstown State University and Kent State's Jewish Studies program. We invited applications from scholars who have recently completed their PhDs. We received tens and tens of outstanding applications and chose 3 for you to hear this year. They promise to be outstanding. The theme that we asked these scholars to propose talks about is a continuation of our programming from last year. The theme was Jews around the world. And so today we're going to hear a talk about the Jews of Suriname. Our speaker, our guest, is Dr. Eli Rosenblatt. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and is currently visiting assistant professor in religious studies at Northwestern University. Eli is a scholar of Yiddish literature, and his scholarship is marked by a global approach to Ashkenazic culture in modernity. His most recent article examines the Yiddish translation and publication of Harlem Renaissance poetry in the Soviet Union between the 2 world wars. In the academic year 2018 to 2019, Eli was a postdoctoral fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. In addition to teaching seminars in modern Jewish culture, Eli is currently working on a book about the Jewish literature and Black culture in Warsaw, Johannesburg, Paramaribo, Suriname, and Chicago. His talk today is entitled Creole Israel, the Jews of Suriname from 1890 to 1960. Before Eli speaks, Chaya is going to give you some instructions about how you can participate in this discussion.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I know 5 o'clock is a iffy time for some of us, but we are happy that you are joining us. So this has been a great partnership, and it's going on between Youngstown State University, the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies, and Kent State University Jewish Studies program. Our goal is to reach not only students, but also communities around us. And I hope that many will do that. In addition to this talk tonight, we have 2 more programs coming up. The one in March and one in April. The one in March is by Dr. Tova Markinson, which is going to be on Tuesday, March 15th. We're keeping it at 5 o'clock. She will be talking about Jewish feelings performing Tzuras troubles at the Yiddish Theater in Buenos Aires between 1880 and 1940, which promises to be very exciting. The April talk is by Dr. Eli Mosenson from YIVO, also on Tuesday, April 12th at 5 p.m. And his talk is going to be Protecting House and Hearth, Jewish Domestic Magic in Pre-Modern Europe, all of which is going to be new to, I'm sure to you, but to us also. And that opens all these, the platform for many questions. We are very happy to host these emerging scholars and share and give them an opportunity to tell us about their scholarship and be on the cutting edge of this new scholarship that's coming up, because Youngstown State and Kent State, as we know, are on the cutting edge of what's happening in the Jewish world, right, Jacob?
Absolutely. I will add that I just threw a link up to the webpage on the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies at YSU. It's on our website. There's a link where you can read more about the upcoming talks and register for them. So you can find that there. I'd also like to thank Eli and implicitly our other scholars who are also giving campus talks for students and workshops as part of this Emerging Scholars Program. I'd also like to recognize Dr. Mroczek from University of California, Davis. Yeah, UC Davis, who has really inspired this program and consulted with us on how to frame it. So she should be mentioned as well. I think in programs like this can be and are very important, as much for us watching as for the field. And so I want to thank Dr. Mroczek for that inspiration and guidance. So without further ado, turn the floor over to Eli.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you very much to Professors Lebens and Kessler for inviting me to give this talk. I'm eager to share some of this material with the people of the great state of Ohio, and I'm happy to be here. So I'm just going to share my screen and play the slideshow. Okay. Just arrange my screen. Okay. So the title of this talk tonight is called Creole Israel, Being Jewish in Caribbean Suriname, 1890 to 1959. And at its heart, this presentation is about an American Jewish community. And I say American in the broadest sense. I mean a Jewish community that exists culturally in the Caribbean, but also in South America, and whose members have shaped the historical identity and share quite a bit, I think, as we'll see, with North American Jews and the European Jews who emigrated to the United States in the 19th and 20th century. Suriname has long been on the radar of Jewish historians. In fact, three of the classic Jewish historians, Heinrich Gretz, Marcus Jost, and Shimon Dubnov, all mention Suriname in their histories, even though they get its character slightly wrong. Gretz and Dubnov misidentified this mainland South American country on the Guyanese Shield as an island. They thought of it, of course, as an island, even though it was part of what we call the mainland.
No, because I muted him.
Okay.
Eli, I apologize. I accidentally muted you for a second.
Oh, okay. Let me just share my screen again. I'm not sure where I was muted, but we'll be okay. So I was talking a little bit about the fact that Suriname is not an unknown country in Jewish historical studies and was mentioned by the great major Jewish historians of the 19th and to some extent the 20th century. And indeed, for much of the past 150 years of Jewish studies scholarship, Suriname was often mentioned and described as an anomalous site of Jewish freedom, cultural independence, and autonomy, where being Jewish meant not only to be left alone, but also to raise a standing Jewish militia to vanquish rebellious slaves and to participate as European equals in a slave system that shaped the Atlantic world. This paradox between Jewish freedom and Black oppression, as Aviva Ben-Or and Andrew R. Hines have masterfully shown in very different contexts, serves as the dialectic upon which scholars of American Jewry have described not only Caribbean Jewish culture, but the culture of American Jews as a whole. This presentation shifts our lens onto the Jewish community after the end of slavery and after the end of Jewish autonomy that slavery afforded the Jews. My first concern here is to illuminate the lives of Jewish cultural activists in Paramaribo, Suriname, and to explore the meaning of the transition in Suriname from an Iberian Portuguese Jewish identity to the numerical and cultural ascendance of Jews affiliated with the Ashkenazic synagogue, and the relationship of this culture to a diasporic Jewish identity, and the relationship of this culture rather than strictly in terms of demography to a global Jewish identity rooted in forms of nationalism, socialism, and anti-colonial nationalism. My second concern is to discuss a little bit about the ways in which the experience of the Holocaust affected this Caribbean Jewish community, and to talk about the ways in which Jews of color might be included in the story of the Holocaust and the history of the Holocaust. And also the fact that 100 Surinamese Jews during the war years were deported to their deaths in German concentration camps. My central argument is that while scholars of the Caribbean have recently focused on Creolization of Jewish culture in the Caribbean, this term has not been vetted as a tool for describing Jewishness in post-abolition Suriname. And so I want to show, just as a general introduction and in an accessible way, how sort of the major currents of modern Jewish history flowed through this Caribbean Jewish community, and a Caribbean Jewish community that in general is lesser known. And so I'm going to forego a formal lecture tonight in favor of going through the visual archive that I've assembled as I've worked on this project, and to really show through visuals and explanation of these visuals exactly what my research project entails. So a lot of what I'm going to speak about tonight is based on 30 years of a Surinamese Jewish intellectual journal called Teruah. And you're looking at the covers of this intellectual journal, which ran from 1939 to 1969. It was published in Paramaribo, the capital city of Suriname, and it really serves as the textual basis, the archival basis for this project about Surinamese Jews in the early 20th century, and the ways in which they presented themselves, the ways in which they saw themselves as part of a larger Jewish diaspora, and also how they rooted themselves locally in a decolonizing Caribbean country. You'll notice from these images that you're looking at right here that the name of this journal was Teruah, which is of course a form of a shofar blast. And you'll notice though in Dutch, or in Dutch transliteration on the top of the journal, that it doesn't say Teruah to our eyes, it says Turo-enga. It's not to be pronounced that way, even though that is how it's pronounced phonetically. In fact, the NG is the way that Jews of Spanish Portuguese origin, or those who were familiar with the traditions of Spanish and Portuguese Jewry, would transcribe or transliterate an ion into pronunciation from the Roman alphabet. So as we begin, I just want to locate us on the map, which is very important to know. Suriname appears here on the northeastern coast of South America. To its south is the country of Brazil. To the right of Suriname, to its east, is the country of French Guiana, or really the overseas department of France, French Guiana. And to the left is Guyana, formerly British Guyana, but today independent from the British Empire. Suriname was first settled by Europeans in the 1600s, and it was settled by Christians, Huguenots, and Jews. And these settlers owned enslaved people from West and Southwest Africa. And enslaved people quickly became the majority in Jewish and non-Jewish space. Something like 90% of the population of Suriname was of African origin and enslaved, and 10% of the population was of European background. One way to locate Suriname in the larger scheme of things, and certainly appropriate to an American audience, is that when Manhattan Island switched from being a Dutch owned space to an English owned space, it was exchanged for Suriname. So the British relinquished Suriname and the Dutch took it over, and the English took over Manhattan and the Dutch relinquished the island. One other important aspect of the era of slavery, as we talk about the earlier era of Surinamese Jewry, is that by the 19th century, certainly by the beginning of the 19th century, but really in the last decades of the 18th century, and as slavery declined, the Spanish and Portuguese dominance, the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish dominance of the community, that is the community that was seen as the founding community of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, gradually ceded itself to the Ashkenazic community, which by 1780 was the vast majority of Jews in Suriname. And they lived not in plantation areas, but in the coast on the capital city. So what's important to know about the era of slavery in Suriname in the 1640s to 1863 is that a good portion, although not the majority, of plantations in the interior of Suriname were owned by Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So if you see on this map, a classic map of the era of slavery in Suriname, you'll see on the right side of the Suriname River, that main river in the middle, something that says Judaic and Synagogue, which is Jewish village and synagogue. And then surrounding that Joden Savannah, as it was called in Dutch, the Jews' Savannah, are a bunch of Spanish and Portuguese Jewish names: Baruch da Costa, Nasi, de Siba, Avram de Pina, Jacques de Costa, and you can see the proliferation of Jewish plantations. And some plantations, very few, but some, were also owned by Ashkenazic Jews. Gerrit Jacobs, who originally departed for Suriname from the Baltic coast of Latvia, was one of the most prosperous plantation owners in Suriname in the era of slavery. And his descendants actually took the name Surinamer. So you'll find, especially in the English Jewish community in England today, there are Jewish community members with the last name Surinamer. The Hebrew text that you see at the bottom right of the map is a handwritten supplicatory prayer that was written by the cantor of that Jewish village that you see on the map, asking God for protection from attacks by self-emancipated slaves, by what came to be called maroons. Slaves would periodically rebel and flee into the rainforest and establish communities, free communities, and periodically would return to the landscape of plantations to plunder and sometimes kill slave masters and such. And so the state of danger that the community lived in, especially in the 1700s, is attested to by one of the earliest examples of a Hebrew prayer that was written in the Americas. This prayer was written in the early 19th century, in 1805, in an instance in which Maroons and those aligned with them were attacking Jewish plantations. So the focus of my presentation today is not on the era of slavery and not on the life and culture of Jews in the system of plantations, but rather how the Jewish community in Suriname inherited the legacy of slavery. And so we're going to start discussing how the inheritance of that legacy of slavery shaped Jewish self-presentation by looking at an image of the Ashkenazic synagogue, still standing today, a beautiful synagogue, established by the Ashkenazic community in 1735 and built in 1842, so in the last few decades of slavery, and it was built by enslaved people. And this synagogue is really the center point of the Jewish community in Suriname, and today even contains the archives of the Ashkenazic community, which are only partially accessible to scholars. But it gives you a sense, if you have a sense of how Ashkenazic Jewish history is conceptualized in American Jewish history or in American Jewish history, we think of Ashkenazic emigration as a 19th century phenomenon. But Ashkenazic Jews, if one widens the lens on the Atlantic world and doesn't focus only on the United States, we'll find Ashkenazic Jews as early as 1700 in the Caribbean space. and part of a migration of Jews to the West that was predominantly of Spanish and Portuguese origin. Here is a photo if we were to be standing in the yard of the synagogue with our back to the synagogue. This is an early 20th century photo of Jews Broadway, which was the main thoroughfare in downtown Paramaribo for the Jewish community. And you can see, if you look down the street, you can see in the distance the Suriname River. But you can see the fence is the same fence. So you're looking at the fence, and now you're looking over the fence. One of the aspects of 19th century post-slavery Jewish culture in Suriname is the beginning of Dutch oversight in the Jewish community. So previous to slavery's ending, the Jewish community was known for its cultural autonomy, for its kind of independence from interference by European powers, and its kind of freedom. It was conceptualized in Jewish historiography as Suriname being an anomalous space of freedom. But as slavery ended, the Dutch colonial powers became increasingly anxious about a colony run amok around the idea that once slaves were emancipated, the society would be descending into chaos. Of course, this is not true, but this is a colonial attitude. And their concerns were extended in some ways to the Jewish community. One of the ways that they dealt with instilling oversight over the Jewish community was by installing a Dutch-born rabbi as the leader of the community. And this rabbi, Moses Judah Levenstein, came from Utrecht in the Netherlands to Paramaribo, and only lasted 5 or 6 years. He died of malaria. But you can see from this commemorative portrait that something very unique about this rabbi, something that was unheard of in other parts of the Jewish diaspora, and that is he was appointed as the rabbi of both the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic community. You would be hard-pressed to find other places where one rabbi was considered the authority over both communities. But it was a function of the colonial nature of the Surinamese Jewish community that a rabbi, a foreign rabbi, a rabbi that had no roots in Suriname, could be considered the leader of the community. And here are just a couple of publications that were distributed around his installation. And then he held a program. He held a ceremony of sorts, celebrating the emancipation of enslaved people from enslavement. And that appears on the right side. And you can see there was a choir, and it happened in 1863. And some psalms were recited, etc. One aspect of the late 19th century, and I think that we're going to be familiar with this from our general knowledge of American Jewish history, is that Eastern European Jewish migration to the Americas increases from 1880 on. And while, of course, there was no sense that Suriname was a major way station or destination for European Jewish immigrants, it did receive in the 1880s a very important trickle of Eastern European Jews. And here is an archival photo that I located of a group waiting for inspection on the Suriname River in the port in Paramaribo. And one wonders if you see in the center of that photo the man that's standing closest to the camera in the pith helmet. To his immediate left, although I could never verify that this man was Jewish, one wonders if this is an image of an Eastern European Jew arriving at the port of Suriname at that time. Now is the moment that I want to introduce the most important protagonist in my research project and his wife, Abraham Philip Sampson and Harriet Elizabeth Morpurgo. These two were pillars of the Ashkenazic synagogue community, And their children were the creators of the early 20th century Jewish community in Suriname. They were the bedrock, the prime family of that community. And you'll notice, I think quite immediately, that Harriet and Abraham Philip Sampson were of mixed racial background. And one asks, why or how does this happen? Why are the pillars of the Jewish community people of color, people of partial African descent? As I referenced before, during the era of slavery, Jews were largely involved in the plantocracy. And over time, the Jewish community creolized. And you can read more about the process of creolization, that is, the mixing of African, European, and indigenous elements in scholarship like Laura Liebman's book, Once We Were Slaves, or Aviva Ben-Or's book, Jewish Autonomy in a Slave Society, or in Stan Mervis's book about Jamaica in the era of slavery, all of which pay very close attention, and attention that's only been recently given in the past decade or so, to the fact that the earliest Jewish communities consisted of people who were of partial African descent. This, of course, derived first and foremost, or at least first chronologically, from sexual violence between Jewish masters and those they enslaved, women they enslaved. And that is really the bedrock, the foundational moment of creolization is the children who were born to Jewish men and African women in the era of slavery. Over time, of course, these relationships proliferated between people of different colors and different backgrounds, and the society in general in Suriname became a deeply multiracial society. Jewish or not, there was a large group of people, especially living in the city, who were the descendants of people who were both European and African. And Harriet and Abraham Philip Sampson were absolutely paradigmatic Jewish examples of the descendants of those who came from multiracial backgrounds. The majority of the country, however, consisted of people of African descent who were the descendants of slaves who had migrated over time from the interior, from the plantations in which their ancestors had been enslaved, to the city, where industrialization in a kind of with a small I, so I won't say large scale industrialization, but small scale industrialization, created an urban proletariat of people of African descent. And here you have an image of a Creole woman with cones of sugar in a lemonade factory in 1900. Another aspect of early 20th century Suriname that's going to come up again in how the Jewish community conceptualized itself culturally and politically is that when slaves were emancipated in the Caribbean in 1863, the Dutch still believed that agriculture was the most viable option for the continued economic prosperity of the colony. And in order to keep those plantations running, they imported indentured labor from British India. And so around 1900, here's a photograph of recent arrivals from India in Paramaribo, probably awaiting a journey to one of these agricultural settlements. And you can see a Creole boy in traditional Dutch colonial dress looking at the women on the ground. It's a very evocative photo. Another aspect of early 20th century Suriname that's going to come up later in how Jews conceptualize themselves is the existence of the Maroons, or people who were the descendants of emancipated or self-emancipated slaves who fled into the interior of the country and lived lives free, for the most part, of colonial interference. By the 1910s, Maroons, still preserving their autonomy, their cultural and political autonomy, would periodically come to Paramaribo to negotiate for transfer of goods, for security, for various reasons with the colonial government. And here's a photo of the Maroon captains, as they're usually rendered in English, the Grand Man, in Paramaribo, photographed here. So one aspect of my work on early 20th century Suriname is trying to understand the politics of being Jewish. What did it mean to be Jewish in Suriname in the early 20th century? And how did Jewishness fit into the racial, cultural, and political hierarchies that existed in the colony in the late 19th and early 20th century? And what I discovered was a unique instance in the Western Hemisphere of anti-Jewish violence, something that might be considered related to the dynamics that would cause a pogrom in Eastern Europe. And the way that this bout of anti-Jewish violence occurred in 1891 is due to the installation of an anti-Semitic colonial governor, Governor Lohman, who came to the colony in 1889 and immediately decided that he was going to appoint himself the defender of the poorest layer of Surinamese society, the poorest layer being those Creoles who descended from people who had been emancipated in 1863. So not Maroons, but people who were freed in 1863 and who were gaining a certain kind of political consciousness as a cultural group and as the bedrock, the foundation of an emerging anti-colonial Surinamese nationalism. Now, Lohman, in order to gain the trust and the dependence of poor Creoles on his rule, decided to enlist the Moravian mission in Suriname. One of the most unique aspects of the Dutch colony and the Dutch colonial system was that, in contrast to the United States, during the era of slavery, it was against the law for an enslaved person to become Christian. There was a sense among Dutch colonial powers that if you became Christian, you would think of yourself as a human being, and that you would think of yourself as deserving dignity. And so they forbade Christian missions from operating in Suriname during the time of slavery. But when slavery ended in Suriname, the Dutch colonial powers changed their tune, and they allowed more and more Christian missionaries to spread a message of Christianity among the poorest, recently emancipated people. And so Lohman decided to use the Moravian newspaper as a way of organizing Creoles. And one of the ways that he organized Creole politics and consolidated Creole politics around his own power and his own position was by using anti-Semitism. So I found this in the archive in the Netherlands, and it's just a quote from an article of 1891 that says, "It will be a great pity for us." This is in the Creole language, in the voice of a Creole journalist. "It will be a great pity for us if you have to give the Israelites of Suriname strength and power to take on all our Black people's affairs in Para," that is the area south of Paramaribo, "and to look after our interests. Then we are completely possessed in the bonds of the devil, for the devils are related to the Jews. Papa, dear Papa, we are the Black people of Para. Help us out help us out of this distress which the Jews have placed on us." Now, why did the Creoles perceive Jewish control of their affairs and Jewish control of their labor? This is largely because, as I said before, immediately after the era of slavery, many Jews of partial African descent became the urban middle and upper class of the city of Paramaribo and came to be part of something called the colonial states. And the colonial states was a political system in which the Dutch appointed local Surinamese to serve as a parliamentary buffer between their ultimate power and the common people, the working people of the colony. And so in Suriname, in the 1890s and in the early 1900s, The colonial states, and you're looking at a picture of the colonial states in the early 1900s with a picture of the Queen in the background of that man standing in the middle, was predominantly Jewish. I think there was about 6 out of 9 or something like that of the members of the colonial states was Jewish or affiliated with the Jewish community. Now, that's not to say that they were European Jews. Many of them were Jews of partial African background, but they were perceived by the lower classes as in control or dominating the economy. Here's a visual example of a Moravian missionary in Paramaribo, or Moravian missionaries in Paramaribo, 5 years before that anti-Jewish violent disturbance. And you can see I've isolated the photo here, so you can see the German missionaries in the background with some of their congregants, you could say. And also you can see the missionary's child there in the front as well. Now, one thing that I hammer home in my writing about this is that this divide between Jews and Christians, really, not necessarily between people of different colors, but between Jews and Christians, caused Surinamese Jews in the early 20th century to have a problematic or to have an ambivalent relationship towards rising nationalist sentiment in the country. So you would expect on some level that members of the Jewish community would identify with Surinamese nationalism, would identify with anti-colonial politics, and to some extent they did. But the Christian nature of anti-colonial politics, the Christian nature of Creole nationalism in the early 20th century caused many members of the Jewish community in Suriname to have an ambivalent relationship. And this is just a photo of a celebration in Paramaribo. Here's a typical photo of a Spanish and Portuguese Jewish family, the Fernandez family, in the early 1900s. And you can see from this photo that it's a typical example of a Jewish community rooted in the country with probably centuries of history in the country. The Fernandez family is still very well known in Suriname today. They own the largest soda bottling company in the country. And this is just one branch of the family. You can see from the dress, you can notice certain things. So black dress, especially, so for example, the older daughter on the left side is wearing a dress that would be considered a modest apparel and a show of piety. Black was associated with piety. The wife in the middle is wearing traditional kotomisi, which is the traditional dress of Afro-Creole women in Suriname. And so she's showing her belonging to Creole culture, to Surinamese Creole culture. And then the rest of the children are dressed in typical Dutch colonial dress. The children in white, which is usually considered a more local taste. Often in the journal, you'll see that there's a kind of a tension between those who choose to wear black clothing, considered more pious and more traditional, and those who concede their wardrobe to the deeply tropical climate. I'm going to only deal with this briefly because it's more the theoretical aspect of my project. But I engage with theories of creolization in my work and talk about how the term Creole is an extremely flexible term. I use Creole in my work as a political term. That is, it's a term that denotes an anti-colonial subject position that resists colonial power. So I'm not talking about the Creole languages of the country or a sense of Creolity as a form of cultural hybridity. Those two things, Creolity and the languages, fed into and undergirded the sense of Creoleness or Sranan identity as a Christian, Black, anti-colonial political identity. Just a photo of the synagogue of the Portuguese Jews, Tzedek V'Shalom. If you've been in Israel recently, you might have noticed that in the Israel Museum, the interior of the synagogue exists. The interior, a beautiful interior, was transferred to the Israel Museum in the 1950s. Just another photo of Jews Broadway. Another photo of the synagogue and the offices of the journal that I worked on. And a picture of the members of the Ashkenazic synagogue in the 1920s. You can see with the black arrow, Abraham Philip Samson, and the red arrow is his son, Philip Abraham Samson. This is on the occasion of the Queen of the Netherlands visiting, and you can see, I always thought it would just be amazing to have this photo colorized, just to see the explosion of local flowers that were used to adorn the synagogue. But you can see from this photo that the members of the community were people of mixed race primarily, with a couple recent arrivals from Europe. Here's a bar mitzvah photo from a bar mitzvah party, and one of Abraham Philip Samson's son, Marcus, is denoted with the blue arrow. A lot of my work, really tries to trace this family's intellectual and political development over time. And here's Marcus with his wife, Daisy. They moved to the Netherlands in the 19-teens or the 1920s, and established a pharmacy. This is an incredibly important aspect of 20th century Surinamese Jewish history, is the migration of many Surinamese people to the Netherlands at this time, including many Jews. And it's just a very, a good photograph of this family. There's them in their pharmacy in the Netherlands. Here's another photo of the Samuels family, another Ashkenazic family, and their daughter Hannah Samuels. And you can see a Creole woman on the right with the youngest child. And then Hannah Samuels was married to Marcus's brother Philip in 1928, and again with the beautiful flowers. Another aspect of this project is talking about the establishment of education in Suriname in the early 20th century, which was pioneered by many Jews. Photos of classrooms, class photos I was able to find in the archives. E.J. Sampson, a relative of the Sampsons you've become acquainted with before. Jewish women were instrumental in the development of an educational system in Suriname. And here you can see the radical diversity of the urban population: European, East Indian, indigenous, African. You really get a sense of how diverse the society was. And E.J. Sampson was, of course, a woman of mixed background as well. Just another photo of the teacher, Judah. Another photo of an agricultural school, also led by Jewish educators. The hospital, a photo of nurses from the hospital. On the second from the right, in the caption of the photo, which you can't see it's on the back, that woman is labeled as Jewess. So you can see that this was kind of a show of different ethnic groups in Suriname, with the Dutch woman, a visitor to the country, as the leader of the hospital in traditional Dutch village dress. Another photo of Richel Sampson in her classroom in 1931. I just love these photographs. They're just very evocative of a moment in time that we know relatively little about. So just a little bit about the journal, and then I'll conclude. So the journal is kind of like a barometer for various aspects of the Jewish thinking and Jewish political thinking and Jewish religious thinking during this time. I just want to say, from the masthead, you can see that the people in charge of the journal were a mixture of Ashkenazic and Spanish and Portuguese Jews. The Jewish community even had its own printing house, Eben Ezer. And its printer was Jewish at this time. You can see also that the Jewish community, in reproducing the seal of Suriname, identified with Surinamese national identity to some extent. And during World War II, during the invasion of the Netherlands by Germany, the Surinamese Jewish community was deeply affected. And this is a description on the right, on the front page, of a service that was held in the synagogue. praying for the safety of the Amsterdam and Netherlands Jewish community. This time was also very politically fractious because the Jewish community in Suriname had no idea who among them were Nazi sympathizers. They knew from the anti-Jewish disturbances of the 1890s that the Moravian Church most definitely sympathized with German Christian forms of nationalism. And to compound that, the Dutch imported, or I should say, the Dutch deported Nazis from other places and dumped them in Suriname, and actually housed them on the ruins of the Jewish synagogue that I showed you in that earlier map. And so here's a picture of those Nazis in Suriname. The Jewish community was very scared of this moment in European history, to the extent that they even dug trenches in front of the Ashkenazic synagogue in the event that it was attacked by local fascists. Very, very scary time to read the journal, very uncertain time. I should say also that the United States Army during World War II occupied Suriname for a short time to defend the Alcoa aluminum plant, which provided aluminum for the war effort for the Allied forces. So there was a sense also that Suriname would be attacked. The Germans would attack Suriname to gain control of that aluminum factory. This is just an image of one of those American soldiers looking at the ruins of the Jewish village Youngstown and the Creole cemetery there. And just another photo of an American soldier on the ruins of that synagogue in the plantation interior. Another aspect of Surinamese Jewish culture is that they were Creole speakers. They spoke Sranan, which is the lingua franca of the country, and the ads published in the paper were often in Creole. So on the left, this ad for Amstel beer says, "Countryman, don't make a mistake. Amstel beer you must buy." And an English speaker will notice "Ja must buy" is Creole, is a Caribbean form of an English-based Creole that you must buy. On the right is some poetry that was written by Abraham Philip Sampson. Another aspect of this, which I'd love to bring to life, and I'm planning to bring to life, are local Jewish recipes. And you can see them on the left there: cassava cake, and different types of peanut cookies, things that all show the influence of African culture on the Jewish community. And just some more pages. There's Philip Sampson on the cover, some modernist puzzles, just some more pages of the journal. And then one interesting thing, I spoke about it before, the fact that many Jews in the Jewish community were ambivalent about the rise of Creole politics because it was such a Christian-inflected nationalism. The Jewish Journal over time, by the 1950s, you'll see on the right side of the masthead that it was printed by Sheikh Mohammed Jamaluddin. And he was the intellectual founder of the Hindustani, or the Indian Party in Suriname, which saw itself as a opponent to the Creole Nationalist Party that was said to represent people of African descent. So you see at this moment the Jewish political consensus aligning more with the descendants of indentured labor and identifying more with an Islamic intellectual, someone who was very important in the preservation of Islam in the colony, stepping in to actually print the journal on behalf of the Jewish community. Just some more poetry, a picture of some people welcoming the Queen. And then towards our conclusion, I'll just show you some images of what emerged also in the 40s, which is a Zionist union in Suriname, which was a group of intellectuals who formed a Zionist reading group and a Jewish nationalist orientation politically. And part of this orientation was spurred by campaigns in Europe to settle European Jewish refugees in Suriname. Local Jews, who obviously had roots for centuries in the colony, were highly ambivalent and oftentimes hostile to the idea of refugee newcomers. And this was based on the fractious political the fractious politics of anti-colonial nationalism in Suriname, and for sure informed by the Christian-infused anti-Semitism that emerged in the 1890s. Local Jews, really most local Jews, some local Jews welcomed the refugees and wanted refugees to come, but many local Jews felt that it would be disastrous to insert something like 5,000 to 10,000 Europeans in rural Suriname, a place that was progressively poorer, impoverished, and ethnically fractured. And so Zionism was an ideological alternative to the territorialism that informed much of the Jewish campaigns for refugee settlement. And there's a picture of Herzl on a cover in a later. And then, of course, you have the Jamaluddin printing this journal. It's an interesting irony. One important thing that's very important to say is that many in the Jewish community who moved to the Netherlands died in the Holocaust. And you can see from the journal that they commemorate those who died in the Holocaust, who had been born in Suriname, and Abraham Philip Sampson's own son and daughter-in-law and his 2 grandchildren died at Auschwitz. And one can use this, I think, to talk about the experience of the Holocaust in Atlantic perspective and global perspective, but also from the perspective of Jews of color, and really give a voice to this experience from a perspective that's not often known. Often when we talk about the suffering of people of color, of people of African descent during the Holocaust, it's not on the basis of their Jewishness. It's on the basis of their political activities, or to some extent based on their Blackness. But in this case, it was a perfect storm, and one has to assume, or one has to accept that Marcus Sampson died on the basis of his Jewishness, and really he garnered the fate of many other Jews, millions of Jews that died during the war. By 1948, the poverty of the community was notable. You can see here from the synagogue that its windows are no longer placed inside. There's a sense of forlorn decay to the building. And then in 1959, Abraham Philip Sampson passes away, and his son moves to the Netherlands. That's Philip Abraham Sampson in his later years in the Netherlands. And these are just some photographs that I took of the Jews Broadway today. You can see on the left in the top corner, the Hotel Krasnopolski. There's still many elements of Jewishness. There's still regular Shabbos services. It is a Jewish community that exists, continues to exist, one of the oldest in the Western Hemisphere, and is lesser known than other Jewish communities in the Atlantic world. But what I hope to show in my research is the way in which the major currents of modern Jewish culture flow through this colony. And at the same time, the uniqueness of this colony, the uniqueness of its roots as a slave society, and the relative size of its Jewish community during the era of slavery widens our lens on what it means to be an American Jew. And the extent to which, even though we may not have our own ancestors embedded in the era of American slavery, it causes us or forces us to think about how we inherit that legacy, knowing that it was a legacy that included, to some extent, Jewish presences that don't necessarily rely on a Black Jewish binary, but talk about these presences in a hybrid or Creolized way. Here's just a photo of a downtown street in Paramaribo, a beautiful, beautiful architecture, and then a photo I took of the Suriname River near the ruins of Yoden Savannah, of that Jewish plantation. And that is where I will leave it. I welcome questions.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Dr. Rosenblatt, for a fascinating lecture and what felt almost like an excursion to Suriname. So thank you. If this were a different context, I would sit you down and pepper you with my own questions and ideas for the next hour. But we have a number of questions in the comments in the Q&A section. And so it's a good time for me to let people know that the webinar format, which we're using, will make it impossible for you to speak with your own voices, but you can enter your questions into the Q&A section. I'll also be checking the chat, and Chaya and I will read out the questions, and Dr. Rosenblatt will answer them for you. So we're going to move in the order in which they were asked. The first question.
Jacob, excuse me, can you make sure that I can get this back to the video, because I can't.
Oh, right. So let's hold on 1 second. You make a call. There you go. You should be able to do it now.
Thank you.
Okay. This is our first time running the webinar in this way.
Yeah.
So pardon any technical difficulties. Our first question comes from Emily Kahn. She writes, "Thank you, Dr. Rosenblatt, for this excellent talk. You discussed the process of creolization and ethnogenesis. How did the reality of colonial gender disparities, European women being relatively rare, interact with traditions of Jewish matrilineality?"
That's a great question. That is a question that is embedded in the era of slavery. So there were a bunch of different phenomena that are kind of interlock with each other, that are discussed in scholarly literature and historical work about Jews in Suriname in the era of slavery. So one of the most obvious phenomena in Surinamese Jewish history is that single men would often come to the colony and immediately engage in what was called Suriname marriage. So they would cohabitate with women of African background, often in terms of coercion and violence. And from there, a class of multiracial Jews would emerge in the 1600s and in the 1700s. And so the realities of the colony were that, as the questioner notes, were that there were far more Jewish men than there were Jewish women. But over time, this actually changes. And we find that in the 1700s and in the 1800s, there are more Jewish women coming from Europe to the colony, because there's a sense that Jews are coming to Suriname to settle forever or for the duration. They're not flowing between Europe and the Caribbean. They're moving to the Caribbean and they're staying in the Caribbean, and the Jewish community is established there with Jewish women as well. But what continues to exist well into even the 20th century are marriages between Jewish men and Jewish women, where the men also hold marriages or have sexual relationships with women of African origin on the side. Sometimes they even petition for divorces, and because they would rather be with with their non-Jewish partners. And what this creates is a class of people who are on the margins of the Jewish community, but who exist within the Jewish community's self-understanding. And so, yes, that's definitely an aspect of it. The other thing that I'll just say is that if you're interested in gender relations in Suriname, the scholar to read is Gloria Vecker, who talks about the ways in which women of African origin in Suriname negotiated and in many ways empowered themselves through these non-traditional forms of relationships, and how heterosexuality, homosexuality all existed in Suriname and we're continue to exist in Suriname through the 20th century.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, what drew you to this region and subject? What is the state of Jewry in Suriname today? Besides the Netherlands, which diaspora communities did the Jewish community of Suriname have strong relationships with?
All very good questions. So I came to this work trying to understand Ashkenazi Jewish culture in its Atlantic context. So my dissertation, my first project, was to talk about the reception of racial language and racial concepts in Ashkenazic Jewish culture. So the way that I did that was by looking at the first Yiddish adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in Lithuania in 1868, and was the first exposure, you could say, through literature, through the imagination, to the language and ideologies of race and racism and racial difference. And then the second half of my dissertation was on the development of Yiddish literary modernism in South Africa. And as I was learning and I was reading about Yiddish literature in South Africa, one can't ignore the cultural significance, the cultural importance of the Dutch settlers of South Africa, who were the first settlers from Europe to come to South Africa and who developed a local Dutch culture. And what I realized is that the early layers of Yiddish literature in South Africa were in dynamic dialogue with the development of an Afrikaans literature and an Afrikaans identity. And that naturally, looking at the close connection between Ashkenazic Jewish history and the Dutch sphere, brought me to Suriname. The importance of Suriname, too, is that it's one of the oldest extant Jewish communities in the Western Hemisphere. It's the only Dutch-speaking country in the Western Hemisphere, and it had the largest population proportionally of Ashkenazic Jews in the colonial and post-colonial periods. So it was logical to go from Europe to South Africa to Suriname to understand Ashkenazic Jewish culture and modernity. In terms of the diasporas of Surinamese Jewry, the Netherlands is by far the major satellite community, you could say, of the Surinamese Jewish community, and many members of the Jewish community today in Amsterdam and also in other cities in the Netherlands have a Surinamese element to their communities, especially the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, but also the Ashkenazic synagogues. The other most important satellite community is the United States. In the 1700s and in the 1800s, as the economy declines, as slavery declines in Suriname, many people start moving from Suriname elsewhere, and the rabbinic class especially the intellectual class in Suriname starts to see its future in the Spanish and Portuguese synagogues of the North American sphere. So, for example, some of the earliest rabbis of Shearith, Israel in New York City were Suriname born. And you'll find that, for example, Jacques Judah Lyons, one of the founding rabbis, one of the earliest rabbis of that community in New York City, was born in Suriname, and his archive at the Center for Jewish History today is replete with materials from his younger years in Suriname. So there is a very deep historical relationship between the Surinamese Jewish community and the early colonial American Jewish community and the post-revolution American Jewish community. Beyond that, you'll find people with Surinamese connections in Israel, especially today. There are people who grew up in Suriname who today live in Israel. And one needs to look at this in terms of a post-colonial country that was really suffered deep economic misfortunes throughout the 20th century. So moving to Israel was a way of improving one's economic lot. And also there are certain elements in the Surinamese Jewish community that today that have connections to Orthodox Judaism in Israel and elsewhere. And so you'll find that even though this community is certainly not associated with with orthodoxy or traditionalism, it does have that element, and that caused a diaspora, whereas Surinamese Jews wanted to live in more religious or more traditional communities.
I think that's a great segue. Thank you. For our next question by an anonymous attendee, what is the feel of Jewish religious practice like? Does it skew more towards Ashkenazi or Sephardic traditions?
That's a very good question. So the prestige is owed to the Spanish and Portuguese layer of Surinamese Jewish community. So the community, for example, you can see in the journal, spells its title in the Spanish-Portuguese tradition and sees itself as the inheritors of that Spanish and Portuguese tradition. And one of the concessions made by the Ashkenazic synagogue when it was established was that they would preserve the Spanish-Portuguese nusach or tradition or liturgy in the Ashkenazic synagogue. This was not always held to over time. And one interesting thing I remember from the journal is that a member of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, considered the major synagogue of that diaspora, went to Suriname, went to a service in the synagogue in Paramaribo, in the Ashkenazic synagogue, and remarked to the community that he didn't recognize any of the liturgy or any of the order of the liturgy. So what developed, I would say, over time is a liturgy and an aesthetic and a tradition that really mixed Sephardi and Ashkenazi. There are elements of both in the community today, but certain elements of Jewish identity that have their homes and that have their historical roots in Europe, like the idea of Jewish nationalism, for example, was due to the influence of Ashkenazic Jews, to a constant interplay between Ashkenazic Jews in Europe and Ashkenazic Jews living in Suriname, just the numeric ascendance of the community, and the sense that over time, Ashkenazic Jews and their associations with Europe came to fill in or stand in for an identification with colonial culture. So the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were seen as the settlers of the colony. They were largely seen as mixed into the African population and localized. Whereas the Ashkenazic synagogue, the Ashkenazic tradition, was seen as closer to the aesthetics and culture of Europe. And this, over time, gave it a sort of cultural dominance. When they installed that Dutch rabbi, Levenstein, in Suriname, this was a symbol to the community that their sympathies, that their identifications ought to lie in European identity. And so today, both a local and a global kind of identity persist.
Thank you. The next question is from Leo Franks. He says, thank you very much for the fascinating lecture. He has two questions. Beyond Zionism, did European Jewish internationalism, humanitarianism, reach Suriname Jewry? And was 18th, 19th century Suriname Jewish conceptions of race self-generated or informed by the metropole?
It's a good question. Actually, can you repeat that question one more time?
Right. Beyond Zionism, did European Jewish internationalism and humanitarianism reach Suriname Jewry? And was the 18th, 19th century Suriname Jewish conceptions of race self-generated or informed?
Yeah. So Zionism is a latecomer to Surinamese Jewish communal life. It really only emerges after the Nazis invade the Netherlands, and there's a sense of a needed kind of Jewish pride, a sense of Jewish solidarity, a sense of identification with the Jewish diaspora. And so a sense of Jewish internationalism, or a sense of Jewish cosmopolitanism or humanitarianism. I think that I don't know how much concrete evidence we have that there was any Jewish, as such, participation in forms of Surinamese politics that were, you could say, liberal in constitution. There were definitely Jews who identified, for example, with socialist tendencies, with communist tendencies in the early 20th century. But often those Jews were attracted to living in the Netherlands. You find that in many ways, Suriname is distinct from other Caribbean colonies in that anti-colonial nationalism starts to rise relatively late in the history of the colony. So much of the Jewish community aligns itself, if it does align itself in humanitarian or internationalist or cosmopolitan sense, it aligns itself or points that humanitarianism or internationalism towards the Netherlands. There's a sense that at this time in the early 20th century, that the Jewish community is identified with colonial power. They might speak the same language as every other Surinamese person. They might look like your average Surinamese person. They might be people of color. They might be brown people. But they are identified in the public consciousness as descendants of European settlers. And so when they look for their space in European society, in colonial society, they see themselves as an upper middle class. And they participate in colonial politics. They participate in colonial governance. They become doctors working in colonial hospitals, lawyers, pharmacists, things that you might recognize in other Jewish communities around the world. And this is due to the fact that they identify with European forms of identity, and economic niches that were seen as deriving from European dignity and European positioning, cultural positioning. In terms of race, Jews in Suriname from its inception were becoming to physically resemble everyone else in the colony. So there was really, in some ways, over time at least, little physical difference between many or most members of the Jewish community and everyone else who was Christian or observed any other kind of religion. They were, in a sense, Creole. They were, in a sense, brown people, free people of color, and they had to abide by the racial hierarchies put in place by the Dutch. And one of the ways that they did this was in their own synagogues, coming up with a two-tiered system of Jews who were on one side, lighter skinned, and Jews that were darker skinned were, on one hand, Yechidim were considered of European background, and congreganten were considered of mixed African background. And they occupied different seats in the synagogue. They occupied, the Jews of Suriname in some ways reproduced the racial hierarchies that existed in the broader society within their synagogue. During the era of slavery, there was a bench behind the rabbi for people who were enslaved. And this was an idea that the members of the community would watch enslaved people because there was a fear that they were unruly or didn't exhibit proper behavior. So, I think that one can't talk about a specifically Jewish self-generated perspective on racial hierarchies. It's more that the racial hierarchies at work in Dutch colonial governance were animated through specifically Jewish forms. And this, of course, derives in part from, racism that was existed in the Jewish community. It also can be seen as a way that Jews ensured and preserved their place in a society in which one could not break racial hierarchies without suffering very deep consequences. So I would say caution against a specifically Jewish self-generated perspective on race, but rather complex Jewish negotiations with the politics of race as they existed in a broader society.
Okay, thank you. Jordan Malott writes, thank you for such an illuminating presentation, Dr. Rosenblatt. So much to think with. I agree. Throughout the presentation, you make significant east-west and north-south connections between either Europe or the United States. I'm wondering if you came across any sort of connections within the Caribbean world.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Suriname is certainly connected historically, politically to other parts of the Caribbean. So, for example, there are moments in Surinamese history when the British arrive in Suriname, and they come generally from Barbados. And so you see that there are, especially in the era of slavery, Jews that live in Barbados who come to Suriname to live or to do business, and vice versa. There are Jews of color, and Laura Liebman's work has bared this out in specific terms. There are Jews of color that were born on other islands, and in those on those other islands, like Barbados, for example, there was much more resistance to the inclusion of Jews of color in synagogue life. So if you were a Jew of color of mixed African European background in Barbados, and you were not treated as a member of the Jewish community as you thought that you should be, you could go to Suriname and be declared Jewish by the Beis Din in Suriname and join that community. Not saying that any specific place is better for a person of color, but it was perceived at that time as Suriname being a place where there were more Jews of color, and there was more of an effort or there was more of an understanding that Jews of mixed African European background would be included in synagogue life. And also for a short time in Suriname, there was a synagogue specifically founded for Jews of mixed racial background. And one thing that shows the attitude of Surinamese Jews that they leaned towards the inclusion of European African Jews in the community is that that separate community of Euro-African Jews was shut down in a short time and forced to reintegrate into the Ashkenazic synagogue. So there was a sense of a broader inclusion, but oftentimes as second-class status within that community.
Thank you, Eli. So the last question we have is from Matthew. Hey, Matthew. I have two questions that are related. After 1948, was there a large population movement to Israel? And were Jews from Suriname able to make Aliyah?
So I have not seen any evidence that there was any mass migration or even any significant migration of Jews from Suriname to Israel after 1948. But as I said before, there's definitely been contributions of Surinamese Jews to Israeli society over time. One concrete example, if one wants to draw connections between Israeli culture and Surinamese culture, is that the development of the Jaffa orange, which was considered to be one of the prime crops of the new state of Israel, was marketed as a kind of Israeli product. The person who was an instrumental figure in the development of the Jaffa orange was a man named J.D. Oppenheim. And J.D. Oppenheim actually, before becoming a Zionist activist, lived in Suriname, working for the Dutch colonial government to develop citrus agriculture in Suriname as a viable agricultural project. And it failed in Suriname, but he writes in Teruah, before his Israeli period, he writes in Teruah about a dream to produce esrogim in Suriname, which he believes that native forms of the lemon in Suriname were closer to the etrog than forms of the etrog that had existed in Europe or in Palestine historically. And so there were definitely, moments in which the development of the state of Israel was augmented by those who had passed through Suriname, and the development of large-scale citrus agriculture is one way to approach that question. Yeah.
It's interesting. Is there another question, Jacob? No, I have a question. You mentioned that Jews of Suriname, some of them made it to and settled in New York, and you mentioned Sherit Israel. So is that the same synagogue that now is contesting the synagogue in Rhode Island, in Newport? Because I just the name sounds.
Yeah, there's a whole network of synagogues that exist in the eastern seaboard in the United States. The Toro Synagogue in Newport.
Yeah, that's the one I'm referring to.
Yeah, exactly. All of which were established by Spanish Portuguese Jews, I think in the 1600s or the 1700s, and whose economic interests at that time were largely in the Caribbean. The formation of all of these synagogues, like Mikveh Yisrael in Philadelphia, is another synagogue of this nature. They all, if you were to look in their archives, are deeply connected to Caribbean Jewish culture and community. And so when we look at synagogues in the early Americas, and certainly historians of the early Jewish Americas know this, it's really an Atlantic story. It's a story of the Jewish Atlantic, and it doesn't necessarily cohere to our sense of United States Jewish history. There's a network, an Atlantic Jewish network that exists, and it includes Suriname, it includes Jamaica, it includes some European synagogues, like synagogues in Bordeaux, France, in which Jewish businessmen are circulating between the islands and the mainland United States, between Europe, and are building synagogues and building synagogue life around their economic interests.
Fascinating.
You've answered a lot of heady questions, and I'm going to resist a question about Jews and multinational empires versus. We're sort of inspired by something that you asked, to ask something a bit lighter, but also a research interest of mine and a curiosity. Did something separate the Jewish food, these recipes that I hope you get to make and share with us? I mean, the recipes, not the food. I'm not asking for you to cook. Is there something Jewish about them? Like, is there something that sets them apart from local cuisine or cuisine, plural?
So it's a good question. I mean, my sense first of all, when you visit Suriname, everyone is eager to identify their foods as Jewish. And, I think wherever you go, this can happen, that countries that have historical Jewish communities and are interested in tourism and all forms of travel and Jewish tourism are going to find the Jewishness in their history and accentuate it. So in contemporary Suriname, there are certain dishes that are very much associated with the Jewish community. What makes these recipes Jewish, the ones that I've found, is that they're all for Pesach. So they don't contain any flour, and they don't contain any they don't contain anything that would be not permissible on Pesach. And that's at the bedrock what makes them Jewish. But there are certain dishes, and you can even YouTube it. You can search like Jewish Suriname recipe, and you'll come up with things. Like one of the national dishes of Suriname is called pum. And pum is a kugel made from cassava. And basically, what people say is the reason that pum is Jewish is because it's cooked overnight, and the people know something about Jewish traditions or Shabbos traditions, and that dishes are often cooked over, the evening over Erev Shabbos in order to be ready on the day. But at the same time, they associate this kind of souffle with European taste. Like one would make a batter and put it in a pan and cook it in an oven. That's associated in Suriname with Europeanness. And so they double in their minds Europeanness and Jewishness. And pum, which uses only local ingredients, a form of arrowroot that only really grows in the Caribbean, because of the way it's prepared, it's associated with Jewishness. It's not the ingredients, but it's the technique or the time that it's eaten. Also, challah bread in Suriname is often widely available, a kind of twisted bread. The reason that it's widely available is that there was a tradition in Suriname of donating challah to the non-Jewish poor. And over time, challah donated to the non-Jewish poor became used in Vinti rituals, the religion of people of African descent that mixes African and Christian elements. They start to use the Jewish bread, the challah bread, in various rituals related to their own traditions. And this comes from, historically, it comes from the fact that many people of African descent, while they themselves were not Jewish, they associated Jewishness, Jewish customs, Jewish food, and Jewish culture with a higher form or the form of master culture. And so it became Creolized. Jewish elements in the larger cuisine became Creolized as part of the local religious custom. And challah bread is one example of that. It's used, you could say, it's employed as a way, as an element of religious observance. Like, for example, you might see it left on a person's grave, things like that. Or you might, like mezuzahs, it's not food, but often people will say that a mezuzah repels ghosts. So they'll put a mezuzah at the door. In many Caribbean religious traditions, the door is the site of great vulnerability. So Jewish customs that existed in Suriname were acclimated to the local sensibility. And so non-Jews, there's a famous story told in this journal of an African woman, a woman of African background, going to a hardware store owned by a Jewish person and asking for a ghost repeller. And the Jewish owner of the store said, "What? Like, what are you? I don't know what you're talking about." And then she explains that it's a mezuzah. And so there's a whole debate about whether this is permissible to sell mezuzos to people who are not Jewish and so forth.
Absolutely fascinating.
Fascinating.
Thank you very much. Wow, it's
a pleasure.
Fascinating. So I'd like to thank once again Dr. Eli Rosenblatt for his talk today. I'm sure that many of you all of you share my sentiments. And I want to announce for those of you who are remaining here briefly our two upcoming talks. Some of you may not have heard Chaya announce them at the beginning. On Tuesday, March 15th, Dr. Tova Markinson will be giving a talk called Jewish Feelings, Performing Tsuris Troubles at the Yiddish Theater in Buenos Aires, 1880 to 1940. And on Tuesday, April 12th, Dr. Eli Moseson will give a talk called Protecting House and Hearth, Jewish Domestic Magic in Pre-Modern Europe. I've already put the links to our website in the chat, where you can read more about these talks and register. Once again, thank you. Chaya?
Thank you very much, Eli. It was really fascinating. You talk about the Jewish world, and there's all these communities that we don't associate necessarily with it being Ashkenazi or being Sephardi. And here they are creating this world of, and their own life, their own kind of way of living, which is really, really fascinating. So thank you so much. And if anybody has more questions, you can direct them to either Dr. Labenz or myself, and we will direct them to our expert. And Eli, we will talk about next Wednesday with the students. Sure. I'll email an informal talk at the Hillel at Kent State, and I will send, if anybody else is interested, it will be another Zoom kind of meeting. It's not going to be a talk so much, but a informal conversation.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. And
thank you. Yeah. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Jacob.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.